black drivers in California were stopped more frequently than expected by law enforcement, compared to their proportion of the state's population. That single line, buried deep in a 2022 government report, exposes one of the state's most persistent and painful truths. According to the California Racial and Identity Profiling Advisory Board, known simply as the RIPA Board, 12.5% of all traffic stops in 2022 involved drivers' officers perceived as black. But black Californians make up only 5.4% of the state's population. Let that sink in. That's more than double the rate one would expect if stops were evenly distributed. It's not an accident. It's a pattern. In 2022, California law enforcement agencies recorded more than 4.5 million traffic stops statewide. Every stop was logged. Every encounter is analyzed. For the first time ever, the dataset included agencies across the entire state. When researchers examined those numbers, a disturbing picture emerged, one that many communities have been warning about for years. Out of those millions of stops, 43% involved drivers perceived as Hispanic. 32.5% involved drivers perceived as white. 12.5% involved drivers perceived as black. At first glance, that might seem like a demographic reflection of California's diversity. But it isn't. The 2021 American Community Survey, conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau, shows that Hispanic or Latino residents make up 39.5% of California's population. White residents account for about 36%. Black residents, just 5.4%. So when 12.5% of all stops target that 5.4% slice of the population, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Black drivers are stopped more often than expected. And when researchers say perceived, they mean this: how the officers saw the driver. Race and ethnicity were not self-reported by those stopped, they were determined by what the officer believed in the moment. More than 82% of all stops across every racial group were initiated because of a traffic violation, things like speeding, broken taillights, or rolling through a stop sign. But about 14.2% were triggered by something else, what officers called reasonable suspicion. That term, broad and flexible, gives officers wide discretion to stop a driver if they believe a crime might be happening. It's legal, but it's also where racial bias often hides. According to the report, drivers perceived to be black or Native American were stopped under reasonable suspicion more often than any other group. The implication is stark. Even when no clear violation existed, these drivers were more likely to be viewed as suspicious. That's the human cost of profiling. An ordinary drive home turned into an interrogation, an identity reduced to a stereotype. Andrea Guerrero, co-chair of the RIPA board and executive director of Alliance San Diego, called this report historic. In her statement, she said, "The scale of data that California is collecting allows us to say definitively that profiling exists. It is a pervasive pattern across the state. We must now turn to the hard work of ending profiling by bringing all stakeholders to the table to ascertain and change the policies and the practices that enable it." Her words are measured, but her message is clear. The numbers no longer allow for denial. Profiling is not just a story told in protest signs or social media hashtags. It's a quantifiable, documented pattern across one of America's largest states. The report doesn't list names. It lists data. But behind every statistic, there's a face. A driver pulled over on their way to work. A teenager stopped outside a convenience store. A parent questioned in front of their children. Each stop carries emotional weight. Fear, anger, shame, confusion. Civil rights advocates argue that these encounters inflict a psychological toll that's impossible to measure in numbers alone. For black drivers, the flashing lights in the rearview mirror are not just a symbol of authority, they're a trigger of historical trauma. In countless community listening sessions, drivers described the same pattern: being stopped for minor infractions, questioned beyond relevance, or searched without clear cause. Some were released without a ticket. Others received warnings. A few were arrested. But many walked away feeling the same thing: they weren't stopped for what they did, but for who they are. Among the most controversial findings in the report is the discussion of pretextual stops. A pretextual stop happens when an officer uses a minor traffic violation, a broken taillight, a missing front plate, or failure to signal, as an excuse to investigate something else. The stated reason might be traffic, but the real intent is to look for drugs, weapons, or other criminal activity. Advocacy groups have long argued that these stops disproportionately target people of color. And the RIPA report backs that up. Black and Hispanic drivers, according to the data, were more likely to be searched after being stopped, even though searches of white drivers were more likely to find contraband. That single fact, more searches, fewer findings, challenges the logic used to justify the practice. It suggests that these stops are not based on behavior or evidence. They're based on bias. To understand why this matters, you have to zoom out. California, a state that often positions itself as a progressive leader, is collecting some of the nation's most detailed policing data. But the very existence of such data means the problem is visible, undeniable, and systemic. It's not about one bad officer or one bad department. It's about a culture of enforcement that continues to treat race as a risk factor. For years, activists across California's cities, from Los Angeles to Oakland to San Diego, have documented the same patterns at the local level. Now, for the first time, the numbers confirm it statewide. This isn't perception, it's proof. The RIPA board didn't just count who was stopped. They examined what happened next. According to their analysis, drivers of color were searched more often than white drivers, except for those perceived as Asian, Middle Eastern/South Asian, or Pacific Islander. And yet, when those searches occurred, white drivers were more likely to have contraband found. This inversion, more suspicion, less evidence, is one of the most telling signs of bias in policing. It means that people of color are being subjected to more invasive procedures without corresponding justification. It's not just inconvenient, it's humiliating. Being asked to step out of your car, being searched in public view, being treated as guilty until proven otherwise. For some, these moments escalate. A verbal argument, a forced handcuffing, sometimes worse. For others, it ends quietly, a ticket, a warning, or a wave of the hand. But the emotional residue remains. The phrase, reasonable suspicion, has always carried legal weight. It's the threshold that allows officers to stop and question someone even if they lack full evidence of a crime. But when the suspicion itself is influenced by race, reasonable becomes subjective. In the data, Native American and Black drivers faced the highest share of stops under this category. That means they were more likely to be pulled over without an immediate, objective reason, only an officer's intuition or perception. This blurring between instinct and bias is what makes racial profiling so difficult to confront. It's not always overt or intentional. Sometimes, it's subconscious, shaped by stereotypes, reinforced by policing culture, and validated by institutional silence. California's struggle with racial profiling didn't begin in 2022. It's part of a longer story. From the Watts uprising in the 1960s to the Rodney King beating in 1991, and the Ferguson echoes that reached Los Angeles decades later, law enforcement's relationship with communities of color has been fraught, complicated, and often violent. The RIPA law itself, the foundation for this report, was passed in 2015 after years of public pressure and advocacy. It required agencies to collect and share demographic data on stops, searches, and outcomes. The goal was transparency. And now, transparency has revealed the scope of the problem. In community hearings, individuals shared what the statistics can't capture. A 19-year-old student from Oakland described being stopped 3 times in 1 month. Each time, officers said his car looked suspicious. He was never cited. A mother from San Diego said her teenage son was pulled over walking home, questioned because he matched a description. He wasn't charged. These are not isolated anecdotes. They're echoes of the same systemic rhythm. Andrea Guerrero and her colleagues on the RIPA board understand that the data must lead somewhere. Policy change, retraining, and accountability. But they also acknowledge what's harder to quantify: trust. Once lost, it's not easily rebuilt. The report doesn't just diagnose the problem. It also offers recommendations. Among them, end pretextual stops, increase transparency in data reporting, require bias training for officers, establish independent oversight to track compliance. But even the report's authors admit, data alone won't solve this. It can reveal patterns, but it can't enforce justice. Real change requires political will, and history suggests that's often the hardest thing to summon. California's population is diverse, but its experiences with law enforcement are not equally distributed. In affluent suburbs, a traffic stop is a mild inconvenience. In many Black and Latino communities, it's a moment of fear, a coin toss between calm and catastrophe. This imbalance fractures the public's faith in the system meant to protect them. And when millions of residents feel over-policed and underprotected, it undermines the very legitimacy of law enforcement. As the RIPA board finalized its findings, one truth became unavoidable: profiling isn't rare. It's routine. The question is, what will California do with that knowledge? Will it continue collecting reports that confirm the same pattern year after year? Or will it finally confront the deeper, systemic roots of discrimination within its policing culture? Because every number in that dataset represents a real human being who lost something: safety, dignity, peace of mind. The 2022 RIPA report doesn't accuse. It illuminates. It shows a state struggling between its ideals and its reality, between progress and prejudice. 12.5% of stops. 5.4% of the population. The math doesn't lie. But the question now isn't about numbers. It's about accountability. The numbers were out. The headlines came fast. Black drivers stopped more frequently in California. Racial profiling confirmed by statewide data. But behind the headlines came something quieter: disbelief, anger, exhaustion. Because for the communities most affected, this wasn't news. It was confirmation. For them, the report wasn't a revelation. It was validation. And the question hanging over California was no longer if profiling existed, but what the state would do about it. In the days following the RIPA board's 2022 report, the response divided California. Civil rights organizations called it a milestone in truth. Law enforcement unions called it misleading. At press conferences from Sacramento to San Diego, microphones filled the air with competing narratives. Andrea Guerrero, co-chair of the RIPA board, stood before a crowded room of reporters. The data tells us that profiling exists. It's systemic. It's measurable. And it's harming trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Her tone was measured, but the weight behind her words was unmistakable. To activists, it was vindication. To police unions, it was an accusation. Law enforcement agencies, from the California Highway Patrol to city departments, pushed back hard. A representative from one major police union said, "These statistics don't account for context, for where crimes occur, or when, or who reports them. Officers go where they're called. We enforce laws, not demographics." That's the defense often heard when racial disparities appear. Crime rates, neighborhood demographics, and call distributions used to explain away the imbalance. But RIPA's data analysts were clear. Even when adjusting for regional differences, the disparities persisted. The stops, the searches, the outcomes, all still skewed. One researcher put it bluntly: "We're not just seeing policing reflect crime. We're seeing policing reflect perception." Across California's cities, ordinary people spoke out. In South Los Angeles, community organizers gathered in a church basement, reading lines from the report aloud. Each statistic hit like a confession. Each percentage felt like proof of what they'd lived. A woman stood and said quietly, "When I drive with my son, I tell him, don't reach, don't move, don't argue. Just survive the stop." In Oakland, a group of Black and Latino youth filmed a social media video dissecting the report. They called it "Driving While Profiled." It went viral in 2 days. Across TikTok and YouTube, creators and advocates used hashtags like #DrivingWhileBlack, #EndPretextStops, and #RIPA2022, pushing the conversation far beyond policy circles. This was no longer just about statistics. It was about living reality. Several departments tried to defend their records, releasing selective body cam footage to show professional conduct. But in doing so, they revealed another truth. Even polite, by-the-book stops can feel threatening when power is unbalanced. A routine license check. A flashlight in the face. A question that lingers too long: where are you headed tonight? The footage rarely showed overt racism. Instead, it showed tone, assumption, and attitude, the subtle ingredients of systemic bias. And those are harder to measure, but easier to feel. In the months after the report, legislators in Sacramento revisited old proposals, bills that had once stalled under union pressure. Among them, a proposal to limit pretextual stops, allowing officers to ignore minor violations like broken taillights unless they directly affect safety. Supporters argued that these stops are the root of racial profiling. Opponents warned that limiting them would handcuff officers. The debate turned ideological: public safety versus public trust. But beneath the rhetoric was a fundamental question: should a cracked windshield justify an arrest? Or should law enforcement focus on genuine threats? The RIPA board didn't dictate policy, it offered data. But in the political arena, that data became ammunition. Andrea Guerrero's nonprofit, Alliance San Diego, organized town halls to discuss reform. At one event, a mother stood up and said, "The data's not new. We've been telling you this. But now that it's written down, will you finally listen?" The room fell silent. Because that's the heart of the matter: who listens and who doesn't. In Los Angeles, the police commission faced public demands for immediate changes to traffic enforcement strategy. They promised to review procedures. They promised new bias training. They promised transparency. But promises are easier than reform. And reform without accountability is performance. Analysts dove deeper into the reasonable suspicion data. The numbers revealed that stops based on reasonable suspicion, not clear traffic violations, were more likely to involve Black and Native American drivers. They were also more likely to lead to searches that found nothing. In other words, the suspicion wasn't reasonable at all. Civil rights lawyers began citing the RIPA report in court cases, arguing that certain stops were unconstitutional because they stemmed from racial profiling. In one Sacramento case, defense attorneys introduced the statewide data as context, claiming it demonstrated a pattern of discriminatory policing. Judges allowed it into the record. The report, once dismissed as just data, was now entering the courtroom. National outlets like CNN, NPR, and The Guardian picked up the story. Headlines focused on California's progressive image under pressure. If even California, with its diversity, its democratic leadership, and its self-promotion as a model of inclusion, couldn't escape systemic profiling, what did that say about the rest of the country? Editorials pointed out the irony. California had passed one of the most transparent policing laws in America, but transparency doesn't equal justice. Seeing the bias doesn't stop the bias. One columnist wrote, "The state can measure racism down to the decimal, but still not control it." It was a haunting observation, a mirror held to the nation. Not all officers rejected the findings. Some quietly admitted what the data revealed. A sergeant in the Bay Area, speaking anonymously to a local reporter, said, "We see patterns in who gets pulled over. We don't always talk about it, but we know it's there. A lot of it's unconscious. It's built into how we're trained, who we're told to look for." That kind of candor is rare, but it exposes the uncomfortable truth: racial bias isn't always intentional. It's often institutional. It lives in policies, assumptions, and traditions. It's in the gut feeling that tells an officer a car looks out of place, when the only thing out of place is the driver's skin color. Community organizers warned that trust, already fragile, was collapsing. In cities like Fresno and Bakersfield, where Black populations are smaller but disparities remain high, Local leaders said residents were avoiding police altogether. "People don't call 911 anymore," said one activist. "They're afraid the help will become the threat." It's a dangerous dynamic. When trust dies, cooperation dies with it. And that makes everyone less safe. That's the paradox of profiling. It claims to protect, but it erodes the very foundation of safety. Researchers from UCLA and Stanford began studying the emotional effects of frequent stops. They found that repeated encounters with law enforcement increase anxiety, depression, and distrust among Black and Latino drivers. Even when no ticket or arrest occurs, the trauma compounds. The RIPA board referenced similar findings. Repeated stops create a cycle of perceived threat and avoidance, where drivers begin to alter routes, drive less, or move differently in predominantly white neighborhoods. The psychological cost becomes invisible, hidden beneath survival strategies. Because when the system tells you you're suspicious, you start to internalize it. Governor Gavin Newsom acknowledged the report publicly but avoided direct criticism of law enforcement agencies. Instead, he emphasized continuing the dialogue. Advocates called the response measured to a fault. Meanwhile, state legislators from the California Legislative Black Caucus began drafting proposals to implement some of RIPA's recommendations, including new rules for transparency, independent audits, and stronger limits on discretionary stops. The question, as always, was whether such bills would survive the political gauntlet. Police unions hold immense influence in Sacramento. Their campaign donations, endorsements, and lobbying power have stalled reform bills before. And they were already mobilizing. A union spokesperson told reporters, "This is a war on policing, not racism." To activists, that framing was infuriating. The old narrative that asking for accountability equals hatred of police. As the debate dragged on, one thing became undeniable. No one could deny the data itself. Even the harshest critics of the report couldn't refute the numbers. They could question methodology, offer alternative explanations, or deflect responsibility, but they couldn't erase the pattern. And the pattern was racial. Some departments tried to downplay the disparities, claiming they were working to improve. Others refused interviews. But transparency laws ensured their numbers remained public. In California's digital era, data is permanent. Every stop, every search, every officer decision, now part of an archive that tells a story generations old. By mid-2023, the RIPA board issued a follow-up statement warning that without action, the data collection effort risked becoming a mirror with no movement. They called for stronger accountability, not just transparency. For community oversight boards with real power. For policy enforcement, not just policy recommendations. Andrea Guerrero summarized it in one line. Transparency without transformation is complicated. It became a rallying cry. Advocates printed it on signs. Activists used it as a hashtag. It encapsulated everything the report had revealed, and everything the state had failed to do. Not every story reached the news. In small towns along California's Central Valley, places like Visalia, Merced, and Tulare, families spoke quietly about their experiences. Stops that turned confrontational. Children witnessing their parents handcuffed for resisting. Tickets written but never justified. These weren't dramatic incidents caught on viral video. They were everyday moments of quiet harm. The report gave those families validation, but not closure. Because data can acknowledge pain, it can't heal it. Criminologists from UC Berkeley pointed out that racial profiling persists even when departments undergo bias training. Why? Because training doesn't change incentives. When departments reward productivity, the number of stops, tickets, or arrests, officers unconsciously look for easy targets. And that often means targeting marginalized communities. The experts recommended rethinking metrics altogether, judging departments by community satisfaction rather than enforcement numbers. But as one researcher said, that would require redefining what safety means in America. And that's a fight few politicians are ready for. California wasn't alone. Similar studies in Illinois, North Carolina, and Missouri showed identical patterns. Black drivers overrepresented in stops. White drivers are more likely to have contraband when searched. The consistency across states shattered the bad apple narrative. This wasn't about isolated departments. It was about systemic design. And if even a state like California, with mandatory data collection and progressive policies, couldn't fix it, the implication was chilling. How bad must it be where no one's keeping count? Despite resistance, some local victories emerged. In San Francisco, the police commission voted to restrict pretextual stops for minor infractions. In Berkeley, the city began shifting traffic enforcement to unarmed civilian departments. And in San Diego, the mayor announced plans to publish real-time stop data for public viewing. These were steps, small but symbolic, each one rooted in the RIPA findings. But activists warned against complacency. Reform without enforcement is performance, one speaker repeated. And across the state, people nodded. Every new statistic, every reform announcement, brought a mix of relief and exhaustion. Communities of color had spent decades demanding proof of what they already knew. Now that proof was official. But justice still felt distant. It's one thing to be believed. It's another to be protected. A man in Fresno put it best in a local interview. We asked for data. We got data. Now we want change. And we're still waiting at the red light. California's 2022 RIPA report was supposed to be a tool for progress. Instead, it became a mirror reflecting something far deeper, a history of bias embedded in the everyday fabric of law enforcement. 12.5%. 5.4%. Numbers that refuse to fade. Because until the stops change, the story doesn't end. 4 years, racial profiling cases rarely survived in court. Proving intent was nearly impossible. But RIPA changed the game. Defense attorneys began attaching the 2022 report to legal motions. It wasn't theory anymore, it was state-verified data. In Sacramento County, a man charged after a pretextual stop claimed his Fourth Amendment rights had been violated. His lawyer cited the RIPA findings. Black drivers stopped twice as often, searched more, found less contraband. The judge admitted the data into evidence, a first for that jurisdiction. In San Diego, another defense team used the same report to argue that their client's stop was inherently discriminatory. It didn't win outright, but it shifted the tone. Judges were finally acknowledging systemic bias not as rhetoric, but as record. Each case became a test. Could raw numbers rewrite precedent? Could data prove discrimination where words had failed? Civil rights groups seized momentum. The ACLU of Southern California launched a project comparing body cam footage against the RIPA database. Their findings echoed the report. Minority drivers were questioned longer, searched more, cited less. Alliance San Diego, led by Andrea Guerrero, filed public records requests across 58 counties, demanding details on each agency's response plan. Many had none. Guerrero's statement cut through the noise. You cannot fix what you refuse to face. And right now, too many agencies are looking away from their own reflection. California's academies began revising bias training modules. Cadets now reviewed anonymized stop data. Instructors asked them, "What patterns do you see?" The exercise was meant to spark reflection. But some recruits felt targeted. One cadet told a local journalist, "They're treating us like we're the problem before we even start." Trainers pushed back. Acknowledging bias isn't accusation. It's awareness. Still, resistance lingered. Bias training, by itself, couldn't dismantle decades of cultural conditioning. A criminology professor from USC summed it up. We're trying to teach empathy inside institutions built on suspicion. In 2023, lawmakers introduced Senate Bill 50, proposing to restrict pretextual stops statewide. Advocates called it the RIPA response. Police unions called it reckless. Hearings stretched for months. Union representatives warned of unintended consequences. Community leaders testified about years of humiliation. The bill advanced, barely. Then it stalled in committee, buried under amendments and lobbying. The message was clear: data might expose injustice, but politics still decides whether justice moves. While politicians debated, the numbers kept coming. Agencies uploaded new stop data for 2023. Preliminary results? The disparities remained. The RIPA board, in its mid-2023 update, wrote, "Early data suggests little measurable reduction in racial disparities. Transparency has increased, behavior has not." In other words, the mirror got clearer, but the reflection stayed the same. Ironically, some departments began using the data defensively. They argued that publishing stop statistics proved transparency, that being measured meant they were accountable, even if nothing changed. It was the perfect paradox. Data intended for reform was being repurposed as proof of virtue. Andrea Guerrero warned about this data complacency. Collecting numbers doesn't equal change. Accountability means consequences, not charts. Grassroots organizations filled the void. In Oakland, a collective called Data for Dignity trained volunteers to interpret RIPA datasets. They produced neighborhood-level reports, mapping exactly where disproportionate stops occurred. In Los Angeles, Stop LAPD Spying Coalition built an online dashboard overlaying race, time, and location. Each dot represented a stop. Patterns emerged: clusters in South Central, almost none in Beverly Hills. The visuals were devastating. You didn't need a degree in statistics to see inequality. It was there in pixels and pain. Local police chiefs faced reporters with uncomfortable questions. Why are black drivers twice as likely to be stopped? Why are searches less productive? Why hasn't anything changed? Some chiefs promised reform. Others deflected. We go where the crime is. But researchers countered, crime isn't color, it's context. Neighborhood density, poverty, and patrol allocation matter. And when policing saturates poor communities of color, disparities reproduce themselves. Data feeding bias, bias feeding data. It's a loop. A feedback system built on fear. Independent journalists began creating interactive documentaries. Faceless narration. Archival footage. Raw statistics. One viral video titled 12.5% combined police radio audio with RIPA charts. It garnered 5 million views in a week. YouTube creators turned state documents into social justice storytelling. TikTok clips broke down the report line by line. For once, policy data felt human. And the faceless digital storytellers became educators of a movement. As pressure mounted, some officers reported depolicing, avoiding stops altogether to escape scrutiny. Critics called it a protest in disguise. Communities noticed slower response times, fewer patrols. Officials called it the Ferguson effect. But criminologists disagreed. Accountability isn't anti-police, one researcher wrote. It's anti-impunity. Still, the perception persisted: reform equals restriction. And between that tension, ordinary citizens suffered both over-policing and under-protection. At the California Department of Justice, analysts continued coding millions of records. Every form, every checkbox, every stop reason, digitized. Patterns appeared over time. Stops spiked in months when agencies held traffic safety blitzes. Search rates rose during federal grant periods tied to productivity. The incentives were visible. Money and metrics steering behavior. One analyst described it quietly. We built a system where performance means pressure, and pressure means profiling. Public schools began including the RIPA report in civics curricula. Teachers used it to discuss data literacy and systemic racism. Students compared their own experiences: who gets stopped near campus, who doesn't. The discussion was eye-opening. For many teenagers, it was the first time they saw their lived experiences validated by official evidence. Education became activism in real time. And awareness spread faster than policy. By late 2023, the RIPA board released new recommendations. Mandatory statewide bias training audits. Community oversight boards with subpoena power. Annual progress metrics tied to funding. It was bold, maybe too bold. Implementation would require legislative approval and budget allocations. So far, neither had arrived. Guerrero summarized it simply. We've reached the edge of data. Now we need courage. Police union coalitions launched ad campaigns titled, "Respect the Badge." Television spots showed officers helping crash victims, saving lives, mentoring youth. The message, "Don't demonize the police." It worked. Public opinion polls showed support for law and order messaging rising again. Activists warned that emotional advertising was erasing statistical truth. The narrative battle was on: data versus image, evidence versus emotion. And emotion, once again, was winning. The RIPA law had been active for almost a decade. 10 years of traffic stop records. 10 years of proof. Analysts compiled longitudinal charts. The lines barely moved. Minor fluctuations, small improvements, but no transformation. One board member said, "We can measure bias by the million, but until it costs something, it won't change." That cost could mean lawsuits, lost funding, or leadership resignations. But few departments faced any of it. Community interviews revealed a phrase repeated over and over: drive differently. Black and Latino drivers described calculating routes to avoid police zones, leaving earlier to reduce nighttime stops, changing cars to avoid suspicion. It's the math of survival, adjusting behavior to bias. And that invisible arithmetic shows how deeply the system seeps into daily life. One resident said, "We're not free to move. We're free to plan around being stopped." Meanwhile, technology blurred the line further. Automated license plate readers, predictive policing algorithms, and data-driven patrol maps promised objective enforcement. But those tools learn from past data, and past data is biased. Feed discrimination into an algorithm, and it automates inequality. Advocates warned, RIPA may expose bias, but new tech could encode it permanently. Transparency in 2022. Automation in 2025. The danger. A digital future of racial profiling that no one can see. By 2024, several class action suits referenced the RIPA findings. In Los Angeles County, plaintiffs alleged that black motorists faced unconstitutional search patterns. Their lawyers cited the 12.5% stop rate as prima facie evidence of discriminatory practice. In San Francisco, another suit challenged consent searches, arguing that consent obtained under fear is not consent at all. The courts now faced a moral question disguised as a legal one. Can statistical disparity prove systemic intent? No ruling yet, but the precedent is forming. Universities turned the RIPA dataset into research gold. Sociologists, economists, and data scientists dissected it from every angle. They found correlation between stop disparities and income inequality, housing segregation, and even local political leanings. One UCLA paper concluded, racial profiling functions less as individual prejudice and more as institutional inertia, the continuation of old geographies of control. It reframed the issue, not bad apples, but bad architecture. In community meetings, people asked a simpler question: how do we forgive what keeps happening? Because data might prove injustice, but it doesn't deliver closure. Healing requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement without action feels hollow. Andrea Guerrero compared it to public health. You can't cure an epidemic by counting infections. You have to stop the spread. Her words hung heavy. Because in California, the epidemic wasn't a virus, it was bias, decades deep. Leaked internal memos from several departments revealed quiet anxiety. Commanders feared morale collapse. Rank-and-file officers complained that everyone thinks we're racist. Leadership worried about recruitment. New applicants were dropping. But buried in those memos was an admission. Our community trust is deteriorating faster than we can rebuild it. That single line said what press statements wouldn't. The system knew it was breaking. Despite the chaos, small victories continued. Some agencies voluntarily ended consent searches unless probable cause existed. Others launched pilot programs pairing officers with social service workers during traffic stops. In Long Beach, early data showed a 15% drop in racial disparities after implementing those measures. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a movement. Change, real change, is always slow, but never invisible. By late 2024, other states began copying California's model. New Jersey, Maryland, and Washington State all passed transparency acts requiring demographic stop data. California's struggle had inspired something bigger, a national mirror. But with each new dataset came the same old truth: disparities everywhere. It wasn't just a California story anymore. It was American. Families still told the same stories. Stops that ended with humiliation. Warnings that felt like threats. Searches that found nothing. The trauma continued while the reports multiplied. One teenager told a town hall moderator, "I don't care about data. I just want to get home." That sentence encapsulated everything the spreadsheets could not. Young Californians who grew up under RIPA's transparency movement started turning into organizers, coders, and lawyers. They built open-source dashboards, AI tools detecting racial bias in stop patterns, and community legal clinics teaching people their rights. Data became defense. Transparency turned into weaponry for justice. For the first time, the generation after the protests was using the system's own data against it. The RIPA report forced California to face itself. And now, the state stands at a crossroads. 10 years of data. Thousands of pages. Millions of stops. And still, 12.5%. The question no longer is whether profiling exists. The question is whether power cares. Because information without transformation becomes complicated. And every day that passes without policy change, the lights keep flashing, the stops keep happening, the stories keep repeating. The California Department of Justice published its latest dataset early this year. More than 4.7 million traffic stops recorded for 2023. The patterns persist. Black drivers, 12.1%. Population share, 5.4%. A fractional drop from 12.5, but statistically negligible. Bias had barely budged. Andrea Guerrero responded publicly. Transparency is supposed to be the first step toward change, not the only step. Right now, California is stuck in the mirror. Her words summed up the state's paradox: the most measured, most studied, and still one of the most disproportionate in the nation. By spring, civil rights lawyers had filed 5 major cases using RIPA data as evidence. 2 were certified as class actions. One case, Williams versus California Highway Patrol, argued that pretextual stops violated both state equal protection laws and the U.S. Constitution. The state moved to dismiss. The judge refused. For the first time, California's own data was being used against it in open court. Every percentage point entered the record as evidence of systemic harm. Legal analysts called it data-driven accountability. Police unions called it trial by spreadsheet. But either way, the numbers had become witnesses. While lawyers fought in court, tech companies moved into the conversation. Predictive analytics, AI traffic enforcement, and automated license plate readers were pitched as solutions to bias. Remove the human, remove the prejudice, the slogan went. But data scientists warned that AI learns from history, and history is biased. Feed 10 years of racially skewed stop records into an algorithm, and the machine will predict the same skewed future. The RIPA board issued a special memo. Automation without equity replicates inequity at scale. Still, cities pressed forward, tempted by efficiency, funding, and the illusion of objectivity. Berkeley and San Francisco expanded programs where unarmed civilian traffic teams handle nonviolent infractions. Initial results were encouraging: fewer escalations, fewer searches, and no recorded racial disparities. Los Angeles announced a pilot to transfer 20% of traffic duties to transportation officials by 2026. Critics called it naive. Supporters called it the first real reform in decades. For many, it wasn't about abolishing police. It was about redesigning responsibility. Faceless documentary channels continued to dominate YouTube. Short-form investigations, animated maps, archival audio, cold statistics under tense music, reached millions. Creators focused on accountability without showing faces, to protect those affected. The format turned data into emotion, numbers into narrative. The public could see bias plotted like weather, recurring storms over the same neighborhoods. Viewers didn't need to read policy papers, they could feel the inequality. In Sacramento, the legislature revived Senate Bill 50, the one that had stalled 2 years earlier. This time, public pressure was intense. Families of drivers stopped under questionable circumstances testified again, reading directly from RIPA statistics. Their message was simple: the data proves it. What are you waiting for? The bill passed committee by a single vote. If it survives the floor, California could become the first state to legally ban most pretextual stops. It would be a historic shift, from documentation to deterrence. Departments launched a new initiative called Trust in Action. The program paired officers with community leaders for ride-alongs and joint workshops. Internal surveys showed mixed results. Officers felt scrutinized, residents felt still targeted. It was progress wrapped in tension. As one participant said, "We're talking now, but we're still not believing in each other." University law schools turned the RIPA case studies into a curriculum. Students analyzed data as evidence of systemic bias, a generation learning to litigate justice with spreadsheets. High school teachers assigned projects asking students to map their neighborhood stops using public datasets. For some, it was the first time they realized policy lived outside textbooks, in their own streets. Economists calculated that racially skewed policing cost California an estimated $200 million a year in lawsuits, lost productivity, and community programs to rebuild trust. For taxpayers, bias wasn't just moral, it was monetary. A policy brief concluded, discriminatory stops are inefficient policing. They divert resources from real crime control. That line hit lawmakers harder than any protest sign. Psychologists documented a slow change in attitude within some departments. Officers who had completed bias training and participated in community projects were less likely to make unnecessary stops. The difference was modest but measurable. For the first time, training data aligned with behavioral outcomes. It wasn't a solution, but it was proof that change was possible. International media picked up California's story. European papers described it as the world's largest racial profiling database. UN human rights observers cited RIPA as a model for transparency and a warning of how systemic bias persists even with data exposure. California had become both an example and experiment. The world was watching how it ended. Families of those wrongly stopped still spoke out. No fiction, just recorded testimony in hearings and town halls. A mother from San Bernardino described her 17-year-old pulled from his car for a broken light, handcuffed, released without charge. 2 years later, he still refused to drive after dark. Her voice trembled. Every number in that report is someone's child. That's the part statistics can't translate. Grief measured in miles, not percentages. Police associations and advocacy groups waged a digital battle. Infographics, hashtags, counter hashtags. One side posted RIPA equals reform, the other RIPA equals reputation attack. Misinformation blurred facts. A 2025 survey found that 30% of Californians believed racial disparities in stops were exaggerated. Truth was visible, but visibility no longer guaranteed belief. Under mounting pressure, Governor Newsom appointed a state commissioner for equitable policing. The office was tasked with turning RIPA recommendations into binding rules. Skeptics called it symbolic. Supporters called it necessary. Either way, it was California's first state-level acknowledgement that racial profiling required continuous oversight, not annual reports. A coalition of universities developed FairLens, an AI tool that monitors live stop data and alerts departments when racial patterns deviate from baselines. Some agencies agreed to pilot it. Others feared the headlines if the alerts went public. Technology had moved from mirror to spotlight, and many weren't ready for the illumination. As RIPA entered its 10th year, analysts proposed a new metric, Trust Index. It combined survey data and stop records to quantify public confidence in policing. Results were mixed: marginal gains in cities that implemented civilian traffic units, stagnation elsewhere. It proved what activists had been saying: policy works only where power lets it. A 2025 UC Berkeley white paper summed up a decade of RIPA. California has achieved unprecedented transparency without achieving justice. It concluded that data collection must be paired with disciplinary teeth, funding cuts, leadership changes, and independent review powers. The recommendation was politically explosive. But without it, nothing would change except the annual headlines. Some good news broke through. The California Highway Patrol reported a 5% decline in overall stops and a sharp drop in searches of black drivers. Community leaders credited the public pressure and the fear of becoming a statistic. Progress was possible, even if fragile. But as one analyst said, accountability shouldn't require fear. It should require integrity. Even as numbers improved slightly, the psychological weight remained. For many Black and Latino Californians, driving still felt like a calculated risk. Parents still gave the talk. Teens still memorized scripts for stops. And communities still held collective breaths whenever sirens flashed behind a car. No law can legislate peace of mind. That's the final frontier of reform, changing not just policy, but perception. 10 years after RIPA's creation, the state is both pioneer and patient, studying its own disease in real time. Transparency exists. Accountability emerges. Justice remains uneven. The numbers still tell the same story, but now millions can read it. And that alone is a revolution in awareness. At the 2025 RIPA public hearing, speakers lined up for hours. Some were students, some retired officers, some families of those stopped. A former sergeant took the microphone. His voice was quiet. I believed I was colorblind. The data showed me I was wrong. That's how change starts, not with defense.